all disasters are local, and that is exactly right. While there is a temptation to wrap up responses in a regional and a national framework and put it into international best practice as well, all that's wonderful. Now go and deliver it next door, in the next street or the next suburb or the next town, and tell me how much application it has. My experience would be it has some, but you're going to have to put a whole lot of local context around it.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Christ Lab Podcast. I'm Colin, you'll be your host. And today we've got a special guest with us, Brenden Winder, who's joining us from Christchurch City Council and works in the field of emergency management in New Zealand. And so joining us sort of 12 hours apart in different time zones is Brenden. He's going to help explain to us sort of the perspective in New Zealand on emergency management, what's going on globally in terms of the field and profession of emergency management, and some of the things that they consider in their planning and their daily lives as well. And so, Brenden, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you being here. And before we get started, how about just a quick introduction and background and share some of the work that you're doing?
Well, hey, thanks, Kyle, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'm based here in Christchurch. I'm here with my wife and two kids. We've been here since the earthquakes. My backstory starts with the military, as I was in the Navy for 10 years, ran around the Pacific, learning some skills there. I then travelled in the States, the UK and Europe, and then came back to New Zealand early 2000s and found myself in emergency management, working as a sole charge EMO in a resort town called Queenstown, where very quickly had to get up to speed on all the risks associated with small resident population, but large visitor population and living right close to the outpoint fault. Then in 2010, there was a large earthquake in Christchurch. I came up to help out then. Came back in 2011 and found myself in a number of leadership and operational positions. I had to learn fast, execute quickly with a whole lot of high scrutiny, big numbers of people watching internationally, nationally, some significant money involved too in terms of investment. That carried on for a number of years and was a turning point for me in investing deeply in emergency management. We went back to Queenstown briefly, COVID hit, and now we're back in Christchurch full time with the family. And I lead the City Council emergency management here and trying to put into practice some of those lessons that were hard won during the earthquake response in 2010-11.
So you were part of that initial response then from the earthquake in Christchurch?
Yeah, I was. So there was two earthquakes of real significance, and then there was 10,000 aftershocks. So we got pretty good at responding to earthquakes. The first one in 2010 did quite a bit of damage in the city of Christchurch, so the metropolitan city, about 400,000 people here. The earthquake hit, no one died, quite a lot of damage was done, and the thinking at the time was our readiness and our response had performed well, and now we were about to kick off on the recovery, and we were partway into setting up the recovery framework and structures when the 2011 earthquake hit, and that was much closer to town, much shallower, did way more damage. There was 185 fatalities in that event, and I just want to acknowledge the trauma that their families went through there, and it did billions of dollars worth of damage to the city. And we thought in 2010 we'd done a good job. What we realized in 2011 was we hadn't, and there was a whole lot more to do. We learned a whole lot, and we learned very quickly, and those lessons are a part of the opportunity today to share with people that haven't been in a metropolitan city during a large earthquake. Maybe we can pass on some of those lessons so that they don't have to learn and go through what we went through.
Yeah, there's a couple of really important points that you raised and a couple of thoughts that I had when I was listening to you explain that. And no doubt there's a significant impact on the communities there. One of my thoughts was you specifically say in 2010, we did something, 2011, we knew we were wrong. And it's sort of rare sometimes in your profession to be able to have that short of a time frame to understand that these bigger decisions you make about policies or recovery options can lead to another result in the next disaster. Can you expand on that a little bit? What did you mean by that? I guess is what I would say. So what was that difference between 2010 and 2011 that makes you say that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things in there too. The scale of the response required was quite different. It rattled the city and there was a whole lot of impact. We thought that was our big one. So we stood up a response and a recovery that was proportionate to that. But we quickly discovered in 2011 that was not even close to the big one. And since then we've discovered there's actually other earthquake impacts that would make the 2011 look pretty insignificant too. We learned a whole lot about earthquakes and earthquake response at the time. But what we also figured out was when we were doing earthquake governance, the structures that were set up to govern the event were suboptimal. We put more structures in place in 2011, which had improved on 2010. And on reflection, some of those could have been improved too. Absolutely not going to put names to any of these circumstances here. But in terms of the structure, broadly, there was too many layers. It was too bureaucratic. It was hard for the community to navigate. It was hard for the public outside of Christchurch, who is through the tax system paying for a lot of what needed to happen here. It was hard for media and comms to link up with the people that needed to. It was hard for overseas investors to connect with the right people. It was complicated. And we did as much as we could at the time to try and relieve that. But in hindsight, we could have done more to be simple, more to be faster, more to be more transparent. And we weren't hiding anything, but I think transparency comes with having systems that allow for that. We could have done more and we could have done better. And I think having that opportunity to reflect on it has been very helpful.
Yeah, very interesting. I don't think you'll have any pushback in terms of people saying it's too bureaucratic sometimes, because I think that's something that if you're reading every sort of after action review and report that comes out, we always find sort of the same trends and indicators in every one of them. Some failure of some system or too many systems and sort of overly complex systems that we're having to navigate. I think what you're saying is echoed across many other disasters as well. I know it's specific to you and what was happening in New Zealand, but I think there's indications of that, sort of across cutting many sort of disasters as well. But one thing I would like to ask now, sort of because of that. So from complex systems to a refined response, obviously there's differences in scales. One of the key issues that has been coming up more and more, at least from my perspective, is the longer term recovery aspect. And so what happens in terms of this institutional thinking that you're talking about, maybe this, trying to refine government, be more transparent, be more sort of deliberate in our approach. And then we have to start thinking multiple years in terms of recovery. How does that look now to you?
To be frank, it doesn't translate well at all. The many lessons learned over, we're now 14 years into the recovery and there's a long way to go. It doesn't translate well because we have a 3-year electoral cycle in New Zealand locally and nationally. It turns over a whole heap of politicians and leadership. And with that IP disappearing and renewing, the collective knowledge dissipates. And many of our good people who learned a whole heap of lessons have gone on to their second and third job. Some have retired since those earthquakes. And those lessons were captured briefly at the time, but there's a lot of opportunities afterwards to go back to them and put them into a new context and use those people in leadership roles again, or many of them will be exhausted by that period of their life, but even put them into mentoring roles so they can provide the current leadership with a sounding board around what to do or what not to do next time. And we've seen examples here in New Zealand where there have been large-scale events and the leadership from one event has not been asked to come in and provide leadership in any capacity into the next event. In some ways, they're building capacity here because everyone gets a chance to lean in and help. But in other ways, we're not really optimizing the lessons that were learned from the last one. I think that's a real shame. We had Cyclone Gabriel here, which was an event in New Zealand a couple of years ago, a reasonably large scale. The people leading that were heading down the same path, making many similar decisions. Some of them could have been well informed by speaking to people who've been in those circumstances before and learned those lessons. And there was people reaching out. I know that I did it and a number of others too, but it didn't land. And I think that was a wasted opportunity for the community, for the insurance sector, for emergency management, for regional, national, local government, and all those places where we see the same mistakes getting made. Disappointing, but structurally, if we can build it so that those lessons get not just identified, but learned and embedded, and that IP can get passed on to leadership, I think we can grow from that. I'm not trying to be overly critical. There's a number of very talented people around. If we could set up a bit of structure that could move on those lessons to stay within the system, I think we'd all be better off.
there's a lot to be said for institutional memory, especially in high turnover organizations, but that does drive the question of leadership in high stakes environments, right? Especially during these whole government responses where you may have, let's say, military versus civilian government, military capabilities, resources that are intertwined into the sort of whole response, as well as military support to civil authorities, plus private sector, plus you mentioned international donors and other aspects. And so what does that look like from your perspective, sort of before in that leadership aspect? And then what does it mean now in terms of when you are now transitioning sort of 14 years later? Are you going down the same path? And how is leadership driving that continuity that you say you needed? Like, what are some of the key factors that support that?
Yeah, really good question. And I don't know that we've done anything special there to enhance that. We were very fortunate during our response. It was serendipity. We had a number of uniformed services available in the city at the time. There was a large military exercise going on for our army, and they had a whole heap of resource available. The Navy was in town, and they were doing a command change. So not only did they have the best ship in New Zealand available for the response, parked up here in Littleton, but they had twice the leadership on board that you'd normally have. So that was really fortunate. Then when the military swung into action, they supported the whole town of Littleton for a couple of weeks there, and then provided an ongoing presence throughout the response, throughout the early stages of the response in the central business district. We had uniformed people on the streets of Christchurch, which is unusual. New Zealand is a first world economy. Our military doesn't have a particularly high profile. We're an island stuck away on the side of the world, so there's a lot of what our military does, but there was high profile and really well regarded. So very fortunate there. But the military also goes through posting cycles. So a number of those people have moved on to very senior positions, which is good, or they're retired. So there's a whole group of younger people coming along now with less experience. A number of our leaders on the civilian side were also ex-military too, so we saw some of that getting leaned on. They weren't young men or young women when they came in, so a number of those are now transitioning to the next stage of their life. The continuity piece is difficult. People are quite quick to move on. One of the challenges we faced in response here was it was pervasive and relentless. It was everyday life in Christchurch. But for the people outside the city, they lost interest, and that's not been critical at all. That's just the reality of if the disaster doesn't affect you and it's 100 miles down the road, after you've heard about it for the 10th night on the row of the news, oh, well, I want to go back to real life. So a number of people in New Zealand did that. And what it meant was the international support, the national support, the media support for the response and recovery over time diminished. Thankfully, the government tipped a heap of money in, and there was plenty of insurance around, so we got things paid for. In the very near future, we've got a really big stadium opening up and a multi-sports complex, so legacies from the response and recovery still to be enjoyed by the city. But the continuity for leadership, those conversations become more and more local because the desire of people that are regional and national to talk about them becomes less. The sharing and spreading of that knowledge and those skills, that experience, and even just seeking support from outside the area diminishes over time. I think that's human nature, but also makes the spreading of that knowledge more difficult. So that opportunity to bring people in from outside Christchurch, to show them what's going on, to help them learn. We did some of that. I'd argue we could have done more of that. Every CEO of every major company in New Zealand should have been made to come here. All the leadership teams from all the government departments and ministries should have been made to come here. We should have had a concerted business-led effort so people can get down here and see what the impacts are like so that we can spread that IP. And in hindsight, it all makes sense. At the time, we were busy. We weren't thinking about that. But having someone sit above and over the recovery and looking at the really long term, because recovery can be quite tactical as well. But having someone or a small group of people, an advisory board, maybe sitting above that, been really useful. We could have had some long-term, longitudinal benefits as well as the benefits we got from doing a pretty good recovery anyway.
Taking a disaster and turning it into a national imperative, right? People need to understand how communities are impacted, not just the hearing on the news for 2 weeks and losing interest, but actually forcing that type of connection. Especially when you're coming from smaller communities or smaller states like the United States, you want to bring people together to make sure that impact is felt. I think that's a very interesting point. In terms of recovery, One of the most interesting things I've started to see across this year is recovery. Everybody sort of understands recovery. We hear things like it takes a long time to recover, it takes years to recover. It's really a drag on not only the community, but, as you said, the economy, getting back to speed, things like that. And I watched, and it was just sort of by chance, I watched this guy on YouTube. He was sort of vlogging his experience after one of the hurricanes recently in the United States. And what was interesting is that he was talking about the difference. You could see it in his conversation about how, okay, everybody says 72 hours of food and water. And he was like, yeah, but 2 weeks into it, 6 weeks into it, 2 months, still no water. You're still not getting back to normal. We have this sort of false idea of time to a certain extent. I don't know the best way to say it, but it's like everything is sort of 72 hourly guidance. But the reality is it's weeks and it's months. And in your case, with devastating impacts like in New Zealand, it's years, if not decades of recovery. Getting back to normal is difficult, especially when you have even just another disaster, disaster, and it's just compounding, and recovery is not linear. It goes up and then there's a disaster and then it's down again, up and down. What are your thoughts now when you look back across this sort of last 14 years and you've been trying to rebuild the community? And what are the key factors that are both the success and what's hampering your progress, I guess I would say?
Yeah, good question. I think one of the challenges for recovery is it's asymmetrical. For some people, they'll recover almost instantly. 72 hours of food and water will be more than enough. Their insurance will kick in and their expensive house will be repaired quickly and they're back to normal and life's good. And then they'll have a business which is going to benefit from the recovery contracting and they'll make some money. The whole thing will be a broadly positive experience. That's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, there'll be people there who are out of their house forever. And they may lose loved ones and their business will crumble and their marriage will crumble and someone could die. So it affects different parts of the communities in massively different ways. Sometimes that will happen within one household where there'll be people that are massively traumatized and other people who see the opportunity. So recovery really is asymmetrical and difficult and complex and evolving, ambiguous and non-linear, all of those things that make it a real challenge for people. So I look at the recovery now, when I step back from it here, Christchurch is in great shape broadly, look, referring to it in the macro, we've got vastly improved infrastructure, vastly improved council services. We've got new facilities, new roads, new tech. There's a whole lot of innovation going on. We've got some very clever people. So Christchurch at the moment, and well, not even at the moment, for the last while and into the future, was regarded as probably the best place in the country to live. And we've got that recovery dividend after being dumped by the earthquake. But that story's not true for everyone. There are still people here who are affected by the earthquake. And the numbers are diminishing, but there are still people here who are traumatized by it financially, socially, physically, emotionally. There's still kids in this city that went through the earthquake, went through the following earthquake. We had horrific mosque shooting in this city as well, and there's many people affected by that. And of course, internationally, COVID. And we've had a couple of fires here too. So there's a smaller group of people here that have been quite badly traumatized. Their lived experience is tough. So we bear that in mind when we're dealing with our community. Some people will be very upbeat about what's happening now. Other people will have a level of ambient trauma that we really need to acknowledge. So the resilience spectrum, the resilience bell curve for us has been stretched. We've got people at one end and people at the other. And I think the trick for us working in the sector is to acknowledge both ends and be smart about how we interact with everyone.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like what you said there. I think that really resonates with a lot of things that we're seeing as well in some of our work. It's recovery is just not infrastructure. It's the entire community. It's going to take time. And you said, I think very eloquently, which is, time has a role to play, right? And time is its own factor. And so there's no way to plan around that. You can't determine what the bell curve looks like. It's something you have to actively deal with. And that's where I think one of the things we have really picked up in some of our international work is we can have discussions about national policy and international policy and programs and what nations need to do. But the local government has a role to play, right? A key role to play, and often as the authority in the response, because all disasters are local, right? First and foremost. What's interesting to me in hearing you talk about this is bringing out the local community aspect and the role of local government. So when you're looking across this experience and the work you're doing now, what is your sort of perspective, I guess is the way I would frame this, of sort of national policies or international guidelines when they come out? And you look at that for your local community. What is your perspective as a local government leader?
The majority of time I see national policy and international best practice. My initial instinct is mild curiosity. Being involved in a reasonably large scale recovery here, the role of national policy and international best practice was limited. I'm not saying there was none, but all disasters are local, and that is exactly right. While there is a temptation there to wrap up responses in a regional and a national framework and put it into international best practice as well, all that's wonderful. Now go and deliver it next door in the next street or the next suburb or the next town and tell me how much application it has. My experience would be it has some, but you're going to have to put a whole lot of local context around it. Pareto's law here, 80-20 is alive, and well, the 20% may well be the international piece. The 80% will be, what is your local context? What does the town next door, or the faith group, or the sports group, or the weather, or the infrastructure, or the history, the tribal connections, or what's the main industry in the next town? If it's X, it'll mean that. If it's Y, it'll mean something different. So the local context is massively important. The role of local government and local leadership outside of the formal structures both have a role to play. I worked for the central government during the response here, and I work for the local government now, and the differences between what they're trying to achieve are quite stark. People who have an understanding of both can be very effective. People who have an understanding of one can be effective if they're willing to learn what the other side's there trying to do, because they both have a role to play. The mixture of everyone's there for the right reason, but they're not always there for the same reason. So having an understanding of all the different players, the national, regional, local context, if you can find that unicorn, you've got someone who can be helpful in recovery.
Yeah, I like the way you phrased it. So let's take that to more of a sort of macro level discussion about the emergency management profession. Maybe not in New Zealand as much, but obviously there's been tremendous scrutiny on the emergency management profession in the United States. Some deservedly so, some is probably not really warranted, right? And is unnecessary. As you're in the profession, what is your perception of, well, I guess the first thing is, are you tuned into these types of discussions and what's happening in the United States is the first question. What is your perception of the struggle session that we're having as a profession with reconciling what the role is in American government?
Yeah, look, I think I am tuned into it to a degree. I'm on a number of international forums with emergency managers where this has been a hot topic. Particularly, New Zealand has two official languages, our Indigenous language, Māori, and English. The majority of these conversations are being held in English-speaking countries, so I can contribute to them and listen in. Other countries that don't speak English, it's a little more difficult for me to do that. But I do pay a lot of attention to what's happening in emergency management, United States, Canada, UK, and other places like that. I don't want to comment on US politics. I think there's plenty enough people doing that. My impression, though, would be because of the way the US emergency management is structured, with a huge amount of grant funding being a significant part of the way it's delivered, that has led to some scrutiny, deserved or otherwise, other emergency management sectors don't necessarily get. In New Zealand, we don't have the same grant funding arrangements. So we don't have the same challenges in terms of competing for funding and having people turn it off and on at their whim. New Zealand is far less politicized along party lines. We don't have parts of the country that are definitely blue or parts that are definitely red. To a degree we do, but nowhere near the same amount where it's sort of stated and causes anyone to take emergency management decisions based on the politics of the local mayor. That doesn't happen here. And I think there's a real benefit in that. Keeping the party politics out of emergency management in New Zealand is a real plus. That's not always the case in the States. I also wonder whether the emergency management systems all around the world could do with a bit of a shake-up and being thought about, reimagined and modernised. What is the role of tech and innovation? What's the role of sharing information internationally and nationally. I don't think we as a sector do that particularly well. I'm part of a group of people who are trying to share information on a topic as consequential as tsunami, and we're struggling to find people who want to talk about it. It's not a risk that people in the English-speaking world that have got much experience of. Now, there are exceptions to that. The northeastern coast of the United States, the Cascadia Fault, there's a number of people up there who love talking about tsunamis because it's their biggest risk. There should be hundreds of people from around the world having these conversations because we've got tens or hundreds of millions of people at risk. Tsunamis are a risk you can't see. We need to be mature about those conversations, information sharing, avoiding pets protection, and coming out of our silos really in those times of calm, when the sun's shining, making the most of those opportunities, because when the crap hits the fan, we want all our emergency management sector people to be best prepared. The recent conversations around funding and restructuring emergency management have maybe distracted away from the core business of looking after our people because people are worried about their jobs, but that distraction has not helped the emergency management sector, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And well said. I mean, there's so much at play in the U.S. system that's hard to pin down one causal factor for why the profession is being scrutinized. People can claim it's many things, but it is coming down to performance. It's coming down to first principles. You're supposed to be protecting the community, and are we actually doing that? I mean, you see that in the floods in Texas. Were we actually protecting the community or not as emergency management? And then there's just lots of questions that have nothing to do with Washington, D.C. It has to do with local government and ownership, right? So there's all sorts of dynamics and ways to look at it. But I think in many ways, like you, there's always opportunities to improve. Maybe there is criticism and scrutiny, and maybe it's rightly so. But at the same time, that's the whole argument of baby and bathwater. Just don't throw everything out at once, because you're still going to need it later on. And so I think that's some interesting point that you made. So as we wrap up the conversation for today, Brenden, what's one of the best ways that somebody can reach out to you? If they do want to talk about tsunamis or your recovery, your experiences, or anything else like that, how can they reach out to you? What's the best way to do so?
I'm not a big fan of social media, so I don't use it, but I am on LinkedIn, and I'm active there, not necessarily because I want to be, but more because I think connecting the sector up and having those conversations is worthwhile. I'm right in the middle of publishing a series called Daily Emergency Management Insights, and I'm just trying to put online stuff that I've learned, and that won't necessarily line up with everyone's experience, but it's stuff that I've learned. So I would invite people to jump in on there and agree or disagree or comment and get the conversation going. So feel free to do it that way. I live and work in Christchurch, and I don't think I'd be particularly hard to find. So feel free to do it that way as well. I'm always open for a chat about emergency management. I enjoy the work. I don't want anyone to get hurt. I don't want there to be emergencies, but I find it very rewarding, massively frustrating. Pay is terrible and the hours are no good, but the work is rewarding. And I think, people who want to have those sort of discussions, I welcome them. I don't think it'll be too hard to find.
All right, Brenden, thanks a lot. And thanks everybody for listening in on the Christ Life podcast. And if you have any questions or need any information from Brenden, feel free to reach out to him on LinkedIn, subscribe to his newsletter, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Brenden.
Thank you.
If you're interested in the work that we're doing at Crisis Lab and the forum itself, you can reach us on the website at crisislab.io/theforum. And of course, you can always reach me on LinkedIn in case you have any questions. Thanks again for listening to the podcast. I'm Kyle, and we'll see you next time.